it says it's live. Look at that. Hello world.
You can only hope. Just gonna like get it up on the screen just to make sure.
Pull up my Facebook page.
I know. I was like,
test it out. Am I there?
Is it happening?
I think it is.
All righty. Well, then, shall we get started?
Sounds good.
Do it.
I don't know how, but I lost you. Okay.
Liz?
Okay, so hopefully people are there. So let's get started.
Okay.
Oh, I can hear it.
Yeah, I know. It's like it's definitely streaming.
Wonderful. Okay, well, hello and welcome to the Escondido Public Library Romance Chats. Yay! In this series, we're going to be talking to different authors that span the subgenres of romance. I'm Jessica Buck, Adult Services Librarian, and I've invited Zoe of Tea and Strumpets podcast to join me for this series. Zoe is part of our Library Romance Book Club and has a podcast devoted to historical romance novels.
I do. Hello, I'm Zoe, and thank you, Jessica, so much for bringing me in on this project. I am very excited to be involved. And today we're going to be talking to the two fabulous contemporary romance authors you see on your screen. But before we get into that, we just wanted to talk a little bit more about romance to set the scene. So I've prepared a statement about romance, but to the seasoned romance reader, romance is an empowering, feminist, and fulfilling genre. But to most of the world, romance is an easy punchline. And to be fair, romance has a storied history that at surface level does make it an easy target. But as we readers know, the moment that you stop and look just 1 millimeter below the surface, perhaps understand the landscape of the times that those books were written in and the sexual revolution that was taking place and the journey to a woman finding joy in sex, learning about her desires in a safe space, and the evolution of the genre in general, romance is so much more than its tropes. And I want to add that romance is also so much more than sex. While sex is an important part of many romance novels, as it represents another dimension to the relationship and another layer of intimacy through the characters, it is not the entirety of the genre in the same way, right, that sex isn't the entirety of a relationship in real life. And here I'd like to have a little quote from romance author Maya Rodale from her book called Dangerous Books for Girls, The Bad Reputation of Romance Novels Explained, where she said that romance novels, quote, declare via the happy ending that love is the most important thing and that love can exist between two people, no matter how they identify or whom they love. And love doesn't care about any rules. It seductively suggests that you, dear reader, might want to try this at home.
I love it. Couldn't have said it any better. All right. So today, as we mentioned earlier, we are joined by two fabulous contemporary romance novel authors, Kristin Rockaway and Lyssa K. Adams. Welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is wonderful.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Absolutely.
And how are you guys? Oh,
it's fine.
And how are you guys holding up in your respective homes right now?
You want to start, Kristin?
It could be worse. It could be worse. It could be better. But this is just what it is. I'm hanging in there. I'm with my husband and my son. My husband has taken up baking, so I am well fed. He made his first sourdough bread today, so that's good. And I'm, trying to get my work done and have my son up with his schoolwork and failing at both. So
relatable.
Yes.
Kind of ditto. Yeah, I'm home with my husband and my daughter. She's 14. So the schoolwork part is a little bit less intensive for me because she just sort of does that on her own. She's got her own little routine where she wakes up in the morning, late in the morning, and she does that on her own. But there's a lot to keep up with, and she's very athletic. So the biggest thing for us is just keeping her busy, because she's going absolutely stir crazy not having sports right now. And it's crazy to me. She has a daily Zoom practice with basketball. Somehow they're practicing via Zoom, like drills and workouts and stuff. It's so funny. But yeah, I've had to, I feel very fortunate. I mean, we're healthy, we're safe, we've got a nice house to stay in, can't complain. But have had to change up my routine quite a bit. It's definitely affected my productivity.
Definitely understandable. I feel the same way in many respects. It's just a very big change of pace, and you kind of have to adapt.
Go with it. Yeah, been a lot of walking.
Yeah, I have my dog. I mean, I was already walking my dog every day, but now, we're taking like 4 walks, just chilling around.
Yeah, I'm actually quite sure that my dog at this point is like, are you ever going to leave the house again? Because you're kind of driving me nuts.
Sometimes my dog looks at me like he's annoyed,
Yeah, for sure.
Sitting on like chairs that he never sits on just because like we were on the couch.
Right. Yes.
I keep like trying to call my dog to come like hang out with me in the office, and she doesn't even respond anymore during the day. She's like, no, this is my time. Like I sit over here right now.
She needs her alone time.
Well, shall we get started talking about you guys and your books?
Sure.
All right. So I guess our first question is we want to know a little bit about you guys for the watchers. I wanted to say listeners. I'm used to saying listeners. But for the watchers here, so can you each tell us a little bit about you and the books that you write? And let's go ahead and start with Lyssa today.
Okay. So I write romantic comedies. I have a series through Berkeley right now called the Bromance Book Club. The first one came out in November, and then the sequel, Undercover Bromance, just came out in March, which feels like 18 months ago at this point, but it just came out March 10th. It's about a group of men who have a secret book club in which they read romance novels to become better partners. They call them the manuals because they think that they hold all the answers to love and relationships and women. I drew a lot on life experience a little bit. My husband is a sports writer. And so when I was sort of crafting some of the scenes in which the guys discuss romance novels, I literally thought, okay, so if I took my husband and his sports writer buddies and I locked them in a room with romance novels, what would that conversation sound like? And I draw a lot on that. But so romantic comedy is my genre, and that's my current series. So
awesome. Kristin, you want to tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, so I also write what I think you would call a romantic comedy. Mine lean slightly toward more like women's fiction, or like chick lit, if anyone remembers what chick lit used to be.
I do.
I love chick lit. And so that's but that doesn't exist anymore. So it's really a romantic comedy but it really explores the women's kind of journey, their whole journey, and romance is a big part of that journey. So that they're going on some journey of self-discovery. Like, for example, with How to Hack a Heartbreak, my last book, it was about a girl. Yeah, there it is. It's about a woman who she works for a startup incubator, and she's kind of the help desk. She's nobody really important. Well, she's important, but nobody sees her as important. So she's treated like crap all day by guys at work, and then she dates online with like Flutter, it's called, so like Tinder, and she's treated like crap on these apps. So she decides to write her own app called Jerk Alert that allows her to, any women it takes place in New York, any woman in the city to say, oh, log their bad dates online or log their bad experiences with men online. And it starts as just like a little, joke for her friends, but then of course, because it's a romantic comedy, it blows up in her face. And it's also a workplace comedy, so her love interest is at work. But it's about her journey to, you know, not only finding love and building her ability to trust, but also her career journey and, you know, navigating a male-dominated industry.
I will say that I've read your How to Hack a Heartbreak, Kristin, and I'm in the middle of the Bromance book club right now. And as a pretty much like completely historical reader, I've just been really excited going on this like contemporary journey. And, you know, I work in tech. Kristin and I have met because we live in the same town. So I've seen her at a couple of book signings. And oh my gosh, that book is like, I have to say, like, I was like, this is my life. Like, I was start off like, oh my God, like the VC boys and all of the just like the jerks that you
Bro culture.
Like, it was a little like, oh my God, you know, moments, but also very vindicating.
Yeah.
Because I was just like, this is my life.
Yeah. And you know, I worked in software development for 15 years. Everybody knows that. So I was toward the end of my career, I was a head of a small software engineering department. And it's real. The men I work with by and large were very respectful and wonderful, but I worked with lots of clients who were like that. And it's funny because people, not funny, but like people read the book and they're like, oh, this doesn't really happen. No, it does.
You described a moment. I remember you described a moment where someone like, I think she was like pitching her app or something and they came in for the hug and she like keeps her pelvis like away from the hug. And I was just like, how many times have I had to do that with clients? Like how many times where really like you want to say like, no, but you can't in the moment just because it's going to be
your client. You can't offend them, you know.
Worse. Yeah.
You and you're like, you know, a hysterical bitch causing a, you know.
Yeah. And I will just also freely admit, I started reading the Bromance book club. I was like intrigued by the premise and I'm just like, I couldn't put it down. So now I'm through, but I'm just like, I need to keep going. I'm like so excited about what's going to happen. So if anyone watching has not read either of these books, pick them up. I think I highly recommend. Well, Jessica, you want to take us to our second question?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, here's the second one. So when did you start reading romance and how did you make the journey from reader to writer?
Shall we switch it up and start with Kristin this time?
Perfect.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so I came late in life to romance, really. I read a lot of chick lit in my early 20s because I felt like that's what it was becoming really like popular. And that's when like I just felt like I related to them because I was the protagonists of these books. I was living in a city. I lived in New York. I'm from New York. I was living in the city and working on my career and for trying to date, you know, so it was a lot of like parallels between myself and these books and I really loved them. But then I stopped reading them largely. Well, they stopped being produced in such large numbers, but I stopped reading them because I felt like I was being judged for it. Like, and it wasn't even necessarily like other people like being open about that judgment, but it was more my own sense of like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be reading these, like, you know, I should be reading literary fiction or something smarter, you know, like it was almost a sense of like shame. But then I wound up, you know, years passed to get married. I had a child. And when I was on maternity leave, I suffered from very severe postpartum depression. I had like a really hard time after I gave birth to my son. And what really helped bring me out of that was reading stories. Like I picked up these old chick lit novels that I loved from the early 2000s just to remember what that was like. And that led me, because I was looking at the publisher, and the publisher for this was Red Dress Inc., which was an old imprint of Harlequin.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
And they, you know, closed down Red Dress Inc. when chick lit became like not so popular, but then that led me to Harlequin. And so that's how I started reading romance, which is kind of, because I needed this happily ever after to just kind of keep me, you know, staying positive. And since then I've like, that's all I read. I really only read stories if I know they're going to have a happy ending.
Yeah, I'm now the same too. It's like
Yeah.
I read exclusively romance, and I delve back into my fantasy novels if I know the author and trust them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a pact between the reader and the author, right? Like that you know what you're gonna get.
Yes.
And once you
Absolutely.
realize that what romance is giving you is that sense of security of that happily ever after, and that happily ever after is there, like you can get emotionally invested in the characters, and you know that. And once you're doing that all the time, you kind of don't want to go back to not doing it. I mean, at least.
Yeah, I feel the same. I gotta have that
Yeah.
happy ending, or it's just stressful. I get too
Yes.
involved emotionally. It's like, oh my god, what's gonna happen?
Yes. You feel cheated at the end where you're like, wait a minute, what? They die at the end?
That's why you have fan fictions.
So Lyssa, when did you first start?
Yeah, so I started reading romance probably, earlier than I should have. I think like late middle school. My grandma read romances, and you hear that a lot from romance writers, that they were swiping them off their grandma's bookshelf, and that was true for me. She read, all of the old classic names that, Judith McNaught and Laverne Spencer and, all of these, these 80s writers and, early 90s writers. And so that's how I started, reading them. And I've always been a writer. I was that kid that, that nerdy kid that always had a notebook full of ongoing stories that, she was working on. And I think I pretty much decided pretty early on that if I wanted to write fiction, that I would write romance. But I had a long career as a journalist, a newspaper reporter, before I switched to fiction. So, that was a very all-consuming career, almost 20 years. And so I was just sort of learning the craft for a long time, when I was working full-time as a reporter. And so it was when I left reporting that I was able to really focus on writing books. And so, but yeah, I think I pretty much always knew that I wanted to write romance. I love this, as we were just talking about, the happy endings and the hope, and the stories of at least in the stories that I was reading back then. Thankfully, we've expanded the genre now, but it celebrated women's inner lives, and women always succeeded in the books I was reading, and I wanted stories like that. So.
And I'm curious, so it sounds like you were reading a lot of historicals when you started. So what brought you to writing contemporary romance?
That's a great question. It's always been that way. I have never wanted to write historicals. Although there is, in Bromance Book Club, I have a little snippet of, the book within the book. You get excerpts of the fake book, the book that they're reading. So I got a little taste of writing Regency, I don't know, 1,000 words of it. But contemporary, I think, is just always where my storytelling skills are. I think my voice is more suited to contemporary, and it's just those kinds of stories I've always wanted to tell. But I was reading contemporaries as well. But yeah, I mean, the big names when I started reading were definitely the big historical authors. Like I said, Laverne Spencer was huge. But eventually, Susan Elizabeth Phillips really made me fall in love with contemporary romance. When I started reading her, I was pretty much hooked on contemporary as well.
And Kristin,
she continues to be my favorite, so.
Yeah, she's great.
Kristin, did you ever read historical, or were you always the contemporary chick lit kind of reader?
Yeah, I was always a contemporary reader, and I didn't start reading historical until I started writing, because then, after I don't think I mentioned this, but like how I got to writing was like when my son was a year and a half old, I finally decided I wanted to quit my job and take 6 months off and finish the novel that I had been starting, forever. So I joined RWA, which I'm not a part of anymore, but I was a part of at the time. And Tessa Dare, I was part of the San Diego chapter, and Tessa Dare had come to she was like my first intro, like my first meeting I ever went to.
Oh man, what was Tessa Dare? Wow.
Yeah, right? And I had no clue at the time. And so I go and I was like, oh my God, this woman is amazing. And I never really been drawn to historical, but then I read her whole Castles Ever After series because that's when it first came out. You know, it was like, oh my God, amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, she's basically the best gateway drug to historical romance for anyone, you know.
Because I did an event with her, right? So she was like my first intro to RW, and then I did an event with her at Warwick's, which was like a dream come true. And then, you know, she even admits this, that like she doesn't necessarily always stick, you know, there are some anachronisms in her stories and she does that purposely, you know, and I love that. I absolutely love it, you know.
I can't help but ask, just because my history with romance was just like, I had a roommate who introduced me to it not many years ago, like 6 years ago. And I think where I got into it before was fan fiction. I was reading tons of Harry Potter fan fiction, and it was very smutty. So like I was trying to read romance. I just didn't know that romance existed for me.
Right.
So anyhow, so then I was in the historical world, and then I was hooked and never came out of it until very recently, when I've been starting to read some contemporaries based on recommendations. And I just cannot fathom how you fall in love with a world that has cell phones. Like, you know, I mean, I can because I live in it, but it's fascinating for me. So it's been fun for me to read these contemporary books, and I'm finding that I kind of maybe like them. So
I'm so proud.
I know Jessica helped with this for sure. So very exciting. And I know we've touched a little bit on, you know, kind of the books you grew up reading maybe, or the romances you started reading. But I guess what we were wondering too was, how do you guys think that what you started reading is different from what we're writing now, and what readers, you know, are expecting today? Who wants to start on that?
You want to start, Kristin?
Sure, Alyssa. You know, obviously, I mean, you know, because we live in the contemporary world, the world has changed. I mean, when I started reading, cell phones were like not ubiquitous at all. And now like we live half our lives, if not more, in our cell phones. So the challenge that I feel like I faced in my writing is, how do I include this, like really, this technology that is so inherent in our day-to-day, it's just everywhere in our day-to-day lives, but how do you do that in a way that's interesting? Because what's not interesting is reading a story of someone like one that's like all just, I scrolled in my phone and I did that, you know what I mean? So like, and how do you make it realistic that people are actually interacting, or especially with a romance, like people text now, you know, like, so how do you get them out of their and into the real world, you know? So I'm constantly, I feel, especially I'm writing a YA now, I feel like I'm struggling to get like out of what are the obstacles that I'm throwing in my character's way that will like get the phone out of their hand, or like use the phone to like make them interact in real life, something like that. And social media too. I mean, that's a huge one, right? You know, you can't like write a whole story about like what's on someone's Instagram page, but you have to incorporate it into the story because it's just there, or that it exists either.
I'm pretty sure though, Kristin, that you just wrote a book about Instagram. If I'm not mistaken.
It was a challenge.
Oh, I bet, I can only imagine. Absolutely. How about you, Lyssa?
Yeah, you know, so what I started reading were historical. So, you know, obviously, just the simple fact that I write in a contemporary setting is much different. But I also think that the what is vastly different, not just in what I write, but in everything that's written today, is the open sexuality of the female characters, you know, in romance novels today. And you touched on this a little bit in your, you know, what you said at the beginning, that, you know, there was a time period when, you know, because of society, I mean, you know, that there was and continues to be a societal bias against female sexuality. And so there still remains sort of an icky factor, you know, that people don't, you know, want to talk about it or, you know, admit that it exists. But, you know, when I was introduced to the romance genre, you know, there were a lot of books in which the woman did not initiate sexual contact, was supposed to, you know, kind of protest at first. It was almost forced to admit that she enjoyed it, you know, because society was not comfortable with the idea of a woman openly wanting it and enjoying it and initiating it. So what's really important for me when I write today is that that there is an equality in sexuality. There's an equality in sexual desire, and who initiates it and who wants it. So I think, to me, that's one of the biggest sea changes, you know, from, I mean, really, frankly, you know, even 20 years ago, there were still some books coming out in which, you know, you still had readers who didn't want a female character who'd had sex before. You know, I mean, there were still books coming out at the, you know, beginning of the 2000s, you know, in which it was, you had to really kind of bend over backwards to explain why a woman might be on birth control already, you know, or so yeah, I think that's been one of the things that's really important to me, is that there is no shame, you know, in what I write today versus what, you know, I started reading. And when you think about it, you know, it's,
Well, if you
go back and read some of those books.
20 years ago is 2000. Seems very close to our time, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I know this is a historical, but it's been getting a lot of press just because they're making the Netflix series. But the Bridgerton book, the first one, The Duke and I, was written 20 years ago. So a lot of, you know, there's one scene in that book that, you know, some people take umbrage with today that they didn't take umbrage with in the big, you know, 20 years ago. And that's it's, in my opinion, you know, a little bit more minor than maybe some of the things we were seeing in the 80s or the 90s in romance. But I just think that's fascinating, you know, just the evolution of the romance reader and also the romance writer, because I mean, you look at that same writer 20 years ago to today, like it's you see a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
How can anybody do something for 20 years and not, you know, change and good, you know, growth, etc.
Yeah.
Like there's so many, 20 years is a long time.
Yeah. And editors too. I mean, editors make a difference too. What they might have told a writer 20 years ago, we might need to soften that a little bit or take that out. You know, today anything goes, you know.
So fun. So Jessica, you want to carry us to the next one we have on the list?
Let's see.
I was at
number.
I think number 4.
You combined?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I kind of combined it, but like it's still a separate question.
Okay. So what do you think today's reader wants to read?
Lyssa, you want to start us? Oh, wait, Kristin started. Go. I was trying to, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, you know, pass up that awkward, everybody talking at the same time, but instead it made it worse.
I was going to say that I think today's reader, particularly today in quarantine, wants some brain candy. They want to escape from the grim, dystopian world that we are currently experiencing. I've heard people going back to comfort reads, like rereading things that they knew, you know, or going back to comfort authors. And honestly, I feel like this is a time for romance. Like, you know, you're gonna get a happily ever after. Like, it's gonna pay off in the end, and you're gonna have a good feeling, and it'll give you an escape. So I truly feel like that's what they're going for. Comfort reads, brain candy.
Yeah, I was gonna say something very similar. I think that people are looking for hopeful stories right now. Books that just simply make them feel good or make them laugh out loud, or just give them a reason to feel good about something, you know, even if it's just for a little while. I've been I get a lot of messages, you know, or have been the past few, you know, several weeks, of people saying, I'm so glad your book came out before the pandemic hit, because, you know, it's given me something to laugh about. And I'm like, well, okay, great. I, you know, couldn't have predicted a pandemic, but I'm glad my book is there for you during this, you know. But I think that people just, they want some hopeful stories right now. I think that I mean, certainly, you know, dystopian still sells, but I think that reality is so painful right now that they don't want to read about it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I recently kind of went on a real reading binge kick and read like 7 books, you know, and to varying, you know, loving them levels. And obviously they were all romances. And so there was just like this absolute desire to get to the end, because that happily ever after is that kind of like endorphin kick, right? And so even if like it maybe wasn't my favorite read, it's like this is what I need right now, you know, and I'm going to get there, and it is still going to give me such a like relief at that moment, and it's just me and my book, and you know, it's such a nice thing to have right now.
I've been the same lately. It's just that we're moving, so all of our books except for a few are packed.
Oh no.
So I've only been able to read what I can get online off of Libby and Overdrive and Hoopla, and fan fictions are always there. But yeah, I need some happy.
Yeah.
Definitely. And thank goodness for e-readers right now. I mean, really, that's makes it really nice. Although I will say, support your independent local bookstore. I have also ordered from my bookstore too, but I love that, you know, I at least have books at my fingertips. So yeah. So do you guys have a favorite trope? I'm curious if you have a favorite trope to read versus to write. Lyssa, you want to start that one?
Sure. I definitely love to read and write second chance stories. I like them because you jump right into the deep end of sort of the emotional pool. You know, there's an existing set of feelings, whether they're, you know, usually it starts out with, you know, kind of negative feelings that they have to work through. So I really love second chance stories. And I think those are probably my favorite to write. But I also really love enemies to lovers, just because the banter is fun, and you know, and that can just be really satisfying to see them finally sort of reach their breaking point when they start to get vulnerable with each other. I love that, you know. So I would say those are definitely my favorite, both to read and to write.
Awesome. Kristin?
I actually really like friends to lovers, because there isn't that, like, because sometimes with enemies to lovers, I mean, there are some amazing enemies to lovers books that I do like, but sometimes I feel like, well, why are you forgiving that the transgression? I mean, it's just maybe because I'm just like a person who has a grudge. But friends to lovers to me is so great because there's all this shared history, so there's no like getting to know you kind of stuff to get over. But then they're like they're rediscovering things about each other, or like finding like, oh my gosh, you know, there's this thing, well, we've always really loved each other and this is why, you know, like for me, that is just so heartwarming. I love it.
That's really interesting. I think historicals have less friends to lovers, just because, you know, men and women couldn't be friends. Although there's the occasional, you know, the older brother or the, you know, younger sister, and sometimes they get away with it that way. But yeah, no, I think that's really cool, because they have that shared history, and that makes all the difference in a lot of cases. I just read a enemies to lovers that was really good. I was very surprised by it. It was a male romance, and their families were like, you know, Montague Capulet, and I hadn't read something kind of like that, where like really it turned out that, you know, of course these people hated each other, but they really had no reason to hate each other. Just their families had, you know, previously wronged. So I liked that angle. And that's the fun thing about tropes, right? Is that there's always something, a little new angle that you can kind of take a spin on it. You don't have to flip it on its head, but just one little diversion can like make the whole story different.
Yep.
So
yeah,
great.
I love Emma by Jane Austen. So I love the whole relationship where they've had this close friendship and then it just becomes something else. I love that.
So I think we have a very important question here. Jess, I've highlighted it in yellow. I think we should go for
Let's go for gold. Okay.
Yeah.
What is your favorite library memory? Love your faces. Like,
Kristin, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I was a big library. Like, I went to the library twice a week. I lived in Canarsie, Brooklyn, and Jamaica Bay branch was my local branch. And I knew all the librarians all knew me by name, and I loved it so much. And so I would go to, I don't know if it still exists, but they had the RIF program, Reading is Fundamental. And they had where it was like every so many books you would get a free book. Every so many books you checked out of the library and read, you would get a free book, and they had like a box. And it was so exciting going next to the children's librarian and like rifling through all the books that I could get. And then they would put a sticker in the back and you could sign your name. And I was actually the youngest kid at that branch to got like a certain number of books, and they threw me a party. They gave me Boggle. I love that.
Oh, that is so
In public library.
love that.
Shaped my love of books.
Oh, wow. The librarian that just makes me so happy.
Loved all those librarians there.
Yeah, I was the library kid too. I mean, I probably went to the library twice a week. Same thing. Now, grew up in a very, very small town. So our library was the dinkiest library you can imagine. And so I would go on the days that I knew new books were coming in, so I could, see what they had new. And the librarians knew, to sort of point out what new was, in the kids section, or as I got older, the various sections. And I think one of my funniest library memories, though, is, so my mom was the president of the teachers union, and they went on strike going into my freshman year of high school. And the strike was basically headquartered at my house. And so, for 2 weeks, when I was supposed to be starting high school, these teachers were just hanging out, were at my house day and night, striking and making picket signs and, all kinds of things. And I went downstairs one day and I said to my mom, Mom, I'm going to go meet Susan at the library. And all of these teachers start clapping. Yay for library kids. So, I was definitely the teacher's pet for just simply being a library kid. But, I was bored. What I did was go to the library. But I will have to say, though, my favorite library story is that I went on vacation to see an aunt and uncle in Florida when I was 12, I think, 11 or 12. And they took us to the local library. This was St. Augustine, Florida. And they took us to the library the first day we got there so we could get some books to read while we were down there. And I found this obscure book called Prima Ballerina by an author named Gladys Mulvern. It was written like 1952. It was like this beaten up hardcover. And it's about a ballerina who goes on her first national tour. And I read it 4 times that week. And I took it home with me. I loved it so much, I didn't return it. And so my aunt and uncle were like, we've gotten these notices about an overdue book. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what happened to that book. I'm sure I left it in that room. Nope, I had completely stolen it. So finally for Christmas that year, my dad sent a check to the St. Augustine, Florida library to pay for this book so that I could keep it. I still have it here in my office.
Oh my gosh.
I still have that book. Yeah, it's my favorite. So sorry, St. Augustine That's a great Library. story.
I'm sorry.
We did pay for it. We did. I stole your book. I loved it so much. I'm sorry.
They had your photo up.
They did.
This girl.
Wanted.
Prima Ballerina.
Girl from Michigan stole our book. Yeah, I felt really bad. But I loved this. I read it like 4 times that week. It was like the best book I'd ever read.
Oh, that's really fun. My favorite library memory is just in my middle school library, so my school library. But I stumbled upon a book called The Black Stallion, and I was a horse mad girl, and I read all of Walter Farley's Black Stallion books, and I was enamored, and it was just like an absolute haze of, the same thing, like you stumble upon a book and you're transported. And I wouldn't have found that book if I hadn't just been at the library browsing, and it did a lot for me. I loved that book. So yay for libraries.
Yay for libraries.
Talking about this. I remember I have so many memories, especially now since I work in the library, but just as someone before I worked, one of my favorite memories was in high school. I went to my high school library because I wanted to check out a copy of Jane Eyre, and the librarian let me check out the copy for the classes that were reading it. So I got it for the entire school year. So I read it so many times, and I was so happy because I didn't have to take it back until the end. I just love that.
That's a nice librarian too. she got it.
She knew.
I love libraries. I get so excited when someone like tweet or post on Instagram a picture of my book or something, and I can tell that they got it from the library. I'm always like, yay, that's so exciting to me that my book is in libraries. I love that.
I also get really excited, like my nephews get to go to the library and they get to pick out books and bring them back, and just seeing them enjoy that and having that process, like seeing young kids go to the library. It's like, I don't know, there's something very heartwarming about it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I love seeing the kiddos. It's the cutest thing.
And you guys have a really big kids section at the Escondido Library. You have a giant room, like murals, and like it's fabulous.
Wow.
Fabulous. So I think we're getting a little long here. So I think we're going to wrap up if we're all good with that. But we have a couple closing questions for you guys. So I guess let's start off with what's next for you. Kristin, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. June 30th, I have my next book is coming out. It's called She's Faking It. It's about a girl who she drops out of college and lives in Pacific Beach. It takes place in San Diego, which is yeah. So I used to live in Pacific Beach. She lives in Pacific Beach, which is this, if you're not familiar with San Diego, it's this really cool town, like on the beach. And there's like a big party vibe there. So she lives there in this illegal apartment, and she door dashes for a living, except in the book I had to call it grub getting. So her only source of income, and then her dumpy car breaks down, so then she doesn't have a source of income anymore, and she's late on her rent. She doesn't know what to do. And long story short, she winds up becoming this like half-assed Instagram influencer, and she was like led by a self-help guru called, her name is Demi De Palma, and in this story she is referred to as the secret meets goop for the Instagram generation. So. And then there's like this hot surfer next door that she falls in love with. And, she's like trying to balance this like fake, and he's like very anti-social media for good reason. And so she's trying to balance this burgeoning half-assed Instagram influencing career with this burgeoning romance with the hot surfer. I guess that's it in a nutshell.
That's really cute. I love it.
That sounds so cute. How about you, Lyssa?
Yeah, so the third in the Bromance series comes out October 27th. So I just finished up copy edits on that. So, I don't know when galleys or anything go out. I'm not sure when when that'll be happening, but I just signed a new deal with Berkeley for 3 more Bromance books. So I just started writing the 4th book. So yeah, so I'm not as productive as I wish I was, but so that's what's next for me.
Productivity right now, I mean, I feel like we should all just take what we can get and be gentle on ourselves,
Yeah. Doing our best.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess finally we want to know, where can readers find you, and where can they get your books? So, Lyssa?
Yeah, so my books are available Anywhere, libraries, of course. Any retailer definitely supports your indies. If you can order from your local indie, that's wonderful. But you can also get it, anywhere books are sold. Online, you can find me on Twitter. I spend way too much time there. Just at Lyssa K. Adams. On Instagram, I'm trying to get better about Instagram. I am there at Lyssa K. Adams. Mostly it's pictures of my dog. Because my teenager no longer lets me take pictures of her. So it's just my dog. So yeah, best place to find me. I do have a reader group on Facebook, the Lyssa K. Adams Book Club. So that's fun too if you want to join. Yeah.
Awesome. Kristin?
Oh yeah, same thing about finding my book at the library. It is available at San Diego County Library, San Diego City Library. I got the audiobook too if you want. In terms of indies in San Diego, Warwick's Mysterious Galaxy. If you're in LA, Rick Bodice. If you're in Brooklyn, Books or Magic. And any, Indie Bound if you're just, not sure where your local indie bookstore is. And in terms of online, you can find me, KristinRockaway.com is my website. And I am most active on Instagram. Actually, I could give you some tips. Lyssa, I did a lot of research for this book.
I turned it over to my daughter. She was shaming me so much. She's like, Mom, you're supposed to like all of these comments. I'm like, you do it then. It's terrible.
We'll
Shamed
talk.
by my own kid.
I'm down.
I'll take your advice.
Oh my gosh. Well, I also feel like social media, like you do what you can, right? And if it's overwhelming, like you just put it to the side. Like sometimes I feel like it's a job all in itself. So yeah, shouldn't feel.
Yeah, I've been spending more time on social media than I ever have. Always on it now.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I want to be the first, I guess. I'm going to be the first to say thank you to you guys for agreeing to come on with us, being our first guest.
No, thanks for having us. It's been fun.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, and thanks to the Escondido Library, Jess, and you for being the brains behind this and organizing.
I'm so happy it worked out. You never know.
And I guess, thank you to both of you guys.
Thank you. Bye, Escondido.